Yes, hello, good afternoon. I hope you can hear me. David, yes, okay, excellent. Wow.
Yes,
So
I can hear
we're,
everyone. Yeah.
yes, David, thank you. So we're having a terrible snag here with the techniques and technology, but finally we have managed to come up with a connection at least. So sorry for that, we're late. My name is Hajo Lanz. I'm the director of Friedrich Ebert Stiftung here in Geneva. I wasn't even supposed to be the one to introduce the topic. I'm fully blank if you want, but we are really glad that we're here together this afternoon to discuss a very important topic, the triple R approach, we call it, to trade. It's about resilience, robustness, and rights-based. And we have some brilliant three speakers here physically with us. We have Bernd Lange, the chairman of the Trades Commission within the European Parliament. We have Bernie Bertosa from PSI in Geneva. And we have Caroline Drommen, who is going to be the moderator. And also she's going to speak on the topic. We have two more speakers that are joining us virtually. And I hope they are with us, but they are with us. Yeah. Okay, yeah, wonderful. But you will be introduced once you will be speaking. Restart or reshape, which button should trade policymakers press after COVID-19 has hit the world? Do we need a more resilient or a more robust multilateral trading system? That's a big. A more resilient system aims at returning to its earlier equilibrium. A more robust system could imply structural changes. Scientists highlight the difference between resilience and robustness, by which the latter ensures a resistance to shocks, while resilience may only lead to reacting to them. This session aims at translating this theoretical debate into a practical approach on reforming the WTO and trade policy at a larger scale. The purpose of trade policy is not to please trade policymakers and to keep them busy. Its purpose is to serve the entire society. WTO and trade policy is an engine, certainly a powerful one, for economic development. However, behind any trade policy measures, as complex and technical it may be, lies the necessity, the obligation to empower people in their economic and social development and to leave no one behind. Whether resilience or robustness is needed, trade policy has to be rights-based, human rights-based. Speakers of this session will offer realistic blueprints and guidelines by analyzing lessons learned from the current COVID-19 pandemic. With this short introduction, and I hope you heard me, I will pass over to our moderator, Caroline, and sorry for this really bumpy beginning. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for organizing this session and for rising to these technical challenges we've been facing so well. I think that we can already say that we're both resilient and robust to have been able to get going despite the challenges of our time. Now, the first speaker is actually going to join us remotely, and it's James Scott, who's at King's College London. I believe we have his presentation, and he's going to respond to the question of whether he thinks the WTO has been resilient or robust during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and whether structural changes are needed to make the multilateral trading system more capable of responding to future shocks, of course, keeping in mind that the objective is to protect citizens, and he'll tell us what he thinks such changes will look like. What I suggest is we'll take James's intervention next, and now I'll turn to Daniel Bertosa from the Public Services International to address that very question. Public service workers who haven't always been recognised as they should have been or as they deserved, neither by policymakers nor by the rest of us. And during the pandemic, I think in many countries, this really changed dramatically, at least in the early days. Remember the clapping on 9 p.m. it was in Geneva. And the question now is, has this recognition led to action? And from a union's perspective, what are you asking trade policymakers to do and why?
Thank you very much. It's quite an honour to be the first speaker, even though unexpectedly. There are a couple of observations I think that can be made about what's been learned from the perspective of public sector workers. And the first is that the pandemic, I think, has demonstrated something which we've all been a little bit suspicious of, but is now beyond doubt, and that is that markets actually have failed to provide some of the basic necessities of life when they've been put to the test in COVID, either because they've been badly designed, placing profits at the centre of certain, the provision of certain services, such as healthcare services. We always suspect it was not a great idea, but actually what we've seen is that it's really not a good idea. Or because markets just can't provide some things like universal health, social care, and social insurance. We have also seen that a lot of what we thought we knew about global value chains didn't really stand up to the stress test. In the early days of the COVID pandemic, there were just massive shortages of personal protective equipment. There were shortages of ventilators. A lot of the track and trace contracts that have been given out to companies that we were told were world class, in fact, have failed quite drastically. And some of the quarantine services that we've seen, for example, in countries like my own, when they've been provided by the private sector, have actually been directly responsible for some of the largest outbreaks that have caused massive economic and social upset in countries like Australia. And so in the past, we've been told that markets are very efficient, but they can sometimes be a little bit unfair, and we need to adjust for that. But I think what COVID has shown, certainly to public service workers, is that markets actually aren't always very efficient. And when they're stress tests, they don't always meet, they're not always up to the mark. And I think that the architects of the globalized system need to reflect on that. And I think this House in particular needs to reflect on that, because trade, as it was said in the introduction, is not an end in itself. Trade in and of itself is not a good thing. It's a good thing when it contributes to well-being. And I think we've had to rethink some of our assumptions. The second observation really is that a lot of the workers that we thought, or we didn't think much about at all in our previous lives, are actually fundamental to our well-being. And as a consequence of not being aware of the role they play, they've been undervalued. And these are often some of the people who've been the losers of the model of globalization that has evolved in the last 20 or 30 years. And we saw with the clapping that suddenly people became aware that these people play a very important role in the functioning of our society and some of the things that we hold most dear to us. And so obviously the emergency service workers, workers in hospitals and healthcare agencies, transport workers are also absolutely vital under lockdown, but also some of those that we haven't necessarily associated with being frontline workers that are actually very important. Policymakers, the people who are too often regarded as faceless bureaucrats or backrooms to be cut. What we realized was when...
Whom do you mean?
What we realized is when something changes and you need policy quick, these are the people that design good policy. These are the people that coordinate between healthcare systems and transport systems. These are the people that are able to redesign social protection system. These are the people that coordinate between local government, state and regional government, and central government. And if they're not doing that well, systems fall apart. And we've seen under COVID that when you design bad policy, people die. And so it's important that we have robust civil servants. I think anybody who's had to look after teachers, who's had to look after children in the last 18 months has had a new respect for teachers who look after some of the most vulnerable people in our society. And care workers in particular, I think, should get a special mention. These really are not very visible parts of the workforce, often highly feminized, often migrants, low pay, precarious work. And yet these are the people who often have been the difference between life and death for many of our elderly and the most vulnerable. So, I mean, I think these are some of the lessons that have been learnt. And I think all of this means that we need to be putting people back at the centre of our economic and social institutions. And we need a fair trade system based on well-being and not simply on profits for large corporations. We need a trade system that promotes development pathways for the global south and doesn't constrain their policy options, and a trade system that, when we need to make decisions and have balanced interests between people and public services and corporations and business and trade, actually balances those appropriately and doesn't default to, well, if trade goes up, then investment goes up, and investment goes up, GDP goes up, and if GDP goes up, everyone is better off. Because it's very, very clear that the economy we have at the moment distributes those benefits in quite unequal ways. In terms of the lessons to be learned, and I think we're seeing reform of the tax system, which I think is good. We're seeing a higher value being placed on care, which is good. In the US, we're seeing Biden's infrastructure plans. That's all very good. But I still think there is some very deep-seated resistance to fundamentally re-examining the nature of our globalization. And I'll mention a couple, but I'll just one example that I think is the most important. And that's the TRIPS waiver, the intellectual property regime. We have a World Trade Organization that has consistently promoted competition policy, often in very unhelpful ways. Yet when it comes to intellectual property, we set up a regime that provides monopolies for some of the largest and wealthiest corporations on the planet, and we give them exclusive monopoly rights to medicines, the very thing that we've been looking at in the pandemic, and that's driven up prices and inevitably will drive down access. And in those rules, we have very people with a lot of foresight 20 years ago put an exemption in that said, if you have a global health crisis, then we can exempt this, because there are some times when corporate monopolies need to give way to the health needs of the global population. So there is an exemption in there. Yet 18 months into this pandemic, we've still not been able to trigger that exemption on the basis that it might set a precedent. Well, if we can't set a precedent in the middle of a global health pandemic, when can we actually use this exemption that we were promised was there precisely for these circumstances? And the consequences of this are astonishing. We have 44% of the world's population who now has one vaccine, which is quite high, higher than I had thought. But only 2% of those are in the low-income countries. And at the same time, we've got 1.7 billion excess doses of vaccines sitting, being held in reserve in the richest countries in the world. It is an obscene situation. Yet in the middle of that, we're not able to push through and trigger the TRIPS waiver on the basis that that will cause problems for the profits of these very large corporations at a time when it is clear that there are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people dying as a consequence of that. My time's up, so I won't touch on a few of the other specific suggestions I was going to make, but I think the point about the TRIPS waiver is a clear one. There are many lessons to be learnt, but it seems that there is still a lot of resistance to actually implementing them and restructuring the global architecture, even in the middle of a pandemic, and even when lives are so obviously being lost as a consequence of not reforming them. So I think we've got some way to go before we can be really confident that those lessons have been learned and internalised.
Thanks a lot. That was some good ideas. I know we're short of time, and I'm afraid that due to late start, we're not getting extra time at the end. So I'm going to have to be even more constraining about the next speaker's time limit. I suggest that we go back to try and get James's comment, who's also going to talk about what possible changes or necessary changes to the system would be.
So I'd like to start by saying thank you to Caroline and thank you to FES for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I'd have loved to have been in Geneva, but unfortunately other teaching commitments mean I couldn't make it. So there are clearly very important issues to be explored concerning how the trade system has fared in the face of the COVID pandemic. As we all know, governments and businesses are rethinking the world of global value chains, just-in-time production, and the extent to which they want to rely on other people at times of crisis. Now, how this will affect the global trade system going forward is a question that we are going to be grappling with, I think, for years. But for me, The most important factor of the COVID epidemic is how it has exposed inequalities in the world, both within countries and between countries. Within countries, for example, in Britain, the least deprived areas have had half the mortality rate of the most deprived areas. And of course, when we look between countries, it's even worse. Many of the world's poorest countries have yet to really start a vaccination program, while we in the UK are now moving into giving people their third jab. And what this tells us, and what I want to focus on today, is that if we want to reduce the impact of future pandemics and future crises, then if we want to make the world more resilient, we need to redouble our efforts at ensuring that the global trade system really contributes to tackling global poverty. Because the fact is, fairly obviously, rich countries have the resources and the technology to deal with these kinds of crises, while poor countries do not. They have to rely on charity or insufficient international efforts like the COVAX scheme that are well-meaning and very useful, but are never actually sufficient. And that in turn means we need to refocus on that age-old but fundamental question of the relationship between the global trade system and global development. Now, it's quite clear that a few countries have made great use of trade to drive their processes of economic development, the likes of Japan, South Korea, now China. But it's also true that these remain the exception. The vast majority of the world's developing countries have not been anywhere near so fortunate, and what they have faced is a series of trade rounds that have consistently marginalized their interests and built trade rules that favour the interests of the most powerful. Now, I would argue that a key underlying reason for this is the mechanism through which new commercial opportunities are created. That is to say, the negotiation mechanism. The GATT, as we know, was built on this adversarial, competitive model of trade liberalisation, in which countries are pitched against each other in a competitive process of trying to secure the greatest trade concessions from others whilst giving as little as possible away. Now, in this kind of process that relies on power politics, it is absolutely inevitable that the most powerful countries will gain the most, while the least powerful countries will have their interests further marginalised. That's just an absolutely inevitable outcome of the way in which we choose to govern trade. Development has been included, but all too often as a form of charity or as a form of what J.P. Singh at George Mason University has called paternalism, and it's always been insufficient. So I would argue that we need to create a more robust trade system. That is, we need structural change. If the WTO is going to be made a force for fostering development, we need to start by rethinking this adversarial model and find an alternative. One such alternative is to build in the idea of the right to trade into the global trade system. That is to say, we should be looking to institutionalize the right to trade as a core principle of how the WTO functions and move away from that competitive bargaining process. Just as creating and institutionalizing human rights can shift the available set of policy options that states face, and so putting the right to trade at the heart of the global trade system could bring about that kind of normative shift that is required to make the system function more clearly in everybody's interests. This may in turn require that the WTO itself be given far more agency than it currently enjoys, so that it can more actively drive the agenda. Because clearly, left to their own devices, the most powerful countries that really control the agenda up till now have demonstrated pretty unequivocally that they are not going to deliver this. Now, this, of course, would be very challenging to the developed countries. It will also be, I think, challenging to developing countries. For instance, I would argue that if we want to make trade really work for human development, we need to revisit the very difficult issue of trade and labour standards. This was understandably, and I would say rightly, resisted by the developing world, but it could be profitably reopened if the mechanism governing the negotiation process is not one that is simply built on power politics, one in which the most powerful get to just set the agenda. So it's not going to be an easy process, and there will be resistance. But institutionalizing a right to trade would be a step toward making the trade system a proper tool for tackling global poverty, and thereby reducing the impact of future crises like the COVID pandemic. Thank you.
Thanks so much, James, for that very, I say, challenging and thought-provoking suggestion. Moving on now, we have with us David Luke, who's also in London, but live, not recorded by video. I think many people know David from his time at the Economic Commission for Africa, and he's now at the London School of Economics. And the question for you, David, is about crises. We can say that a crisis is a test of a system's stability, really. And with the trade system, this past few months or past year and a half have made a number of weaknesses increasingly obvious, and ideas for reform emerging out of that are becoming more concrete. So coming back to the African continent, would you say that the multilateral trading system in its current form has proved to be a good and stable system during the pandemic? Or if we want to put it differently, has Africa received what it's needed from the multilateral trading system? And what lessons can we learn from this experience?
Thank you, Caroline, and thanks also to the Frederick Ebert Stiftung for inviting me. Clearly this is a session with some very thought-provoking ideas, especially from what we've just heard from James. Perhaps I'll need to bring things down a little bit more to the reality that we are grappling with on the African continent. So let me begin by saying that, yes, in some ways, the multilateral trading system has proved to be a good ally for Africa during the pandemic. But I think the main insights and lessons can be found in comparing Africa's internal and external trade performance during the pandemic. But let me make 3 points about the WTO and then come to this issue of Africa's internal and external trade performance. First, I think the WTO's surveillance function through the biannual trade monitoring exercise tracks the trade facilitating measures and trade restrictive measures that were adopted during the pandemic. Many African and low-income countries depend on imports of personal protective equipment, PPE, and related medical supplies. The most recent WTO trade monitoring report of July 2021 noted that the export restrictions accounted for 84% of all restrictions recorded. But as production and trade expanded, many of these restrictions are being rolled back from the peak during 2020. So in a sense, the WTO surveillance was very helpful in calling out export restrictions everywhere and ensuring transparency. Then second, I think the WTO's rulemaking function has provided a gateway for the current discussion of a TRIPS waiver of IP protections targeted at COVID-19 related medical technologies. Now, whatever the outcome of the TRIPS waiver discussion, the issue of affordable and equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines, medicines, and technologies is high on the global agenda. I think this was evident in the opening session earlier today that was addressed by the President of South Africa, among others. So this current discussion has helped to generate a range of responses that we can observe today. I'm not suggesting that we have arrived at what should be an equitable outcome, but I'm only saying that this discussion has opened the way for these issues to be put on the agenda. Then the third point I can make about the WTO is the leadership change process, which coincided with the pandemic. And the WTO African member states united behind a compelling candidate, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who, as we know, became the first African and first woman WTO Director General. With new leadership, the WTO has become an important voice on advocacy for vaccine equity and the risks of the current K-shaped global economic recovery. Now, let me turn to the insights from comparing Africa's internal and external trade performance during the pandemic. Intra-African trade comprises a smaller share of commodities and has more manufacturers than does Africa's trade with the rest of the world. As a result, intra-African trade is less susceptible to the vicissitudes of international commodity prices. But intra-African trade is also more dependent on functioning land borders and the economic health of contiguous neighbors. What we observed was intra-African trade fell sharply in 2021 after the imposition of border and movement restrictions, which occurred in late March 2020. In April, intra-African trade fell sharply in April 2020 after the imposition of border and movement restrictions, which occurred in late March 2020 for most African countries. But then it recovered moderately better and slightly faster than exports to countries outside the continent. In the course of 2020, intra-African trade fell by 10% compared to 2019 levels, better than the 16% fall in external exports. There is also evidence that the current crisis in the global shipping sector has impacted Africa's external trade. But while intra-African exports proved more resilient, as we may say, than exports to the world as a whole, there was variance across African regions. In Eastern Southern Africa, intra-African exports suffered more than exports to the rest of the world. In Southern Africa, this likely owes to the severity of the lockdown measures imposed in its largest economy, South Africa. Now, the better performance of intra-African trade has two likely foundations. First, reduced dependence on fragile commodity prices, and second, impressive coordination steps taken by African countries and the regional economic communities to facilitate safe trade as border movements became more difficult. This involved regional guidelines on issues such as border health screening, testing and certification, truck crew sizes, digitalized trade procedures, electronic cargo tracking, and information sharing. One interesting aspect of Africa's informal trade, which has been estimated to be between 7 and 16% of formal trade, was also observed, and that is the safe trade initiatives generated a tendency towards the aggregation of merchandise, which would normally have been sent across borders in small bundles. Now, if this trend continues, it can help to enhance formalization. Now, to return to the theme of the session, I would say that the relative resilience of intra-African trade during 2020 points to a key opportunity for achieving robustness and inclusion here as a proxy for rights-based trade, through the effective and timely implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Recent modeling results from the UN Economic Commission for Africa, the World Bank, and so on, project a positive impact on growth, GDP, and welfare, with knock-on effects on industrial development, employment, and poverty reduction. So if fully implemented, the AfCFTA is expected to provide a significant boost to intra-African trade, which can also provide a pathway to improve Africa's performance in world trade and enhance the diversification of exports to the global economy. Overall, as I've said, and here to conclude, the multilateral trading system has been, I would say, overall a good ally for Africa during the current pandemic. But the main lesson that can be drawn is from Africa's internal and external trade performance, which suggests that there's urgent need for trade reforms driven by AfCFTA implementation. So let me stop here with this argument, as it were, that I'd like to put to this session. Thank you, Caroline.
Thanks, David. Thanks very interesting and more upbeat in your conclusions than other speakers so far. And I particularly note that you differ quite strongly with Daniel on the TRIPS waiver issue. And in fact, I want to take this moment for a bit of housekeeping, which is to say, please, I think we will have time for a couple at least of questions from the audience. So, the people in the room, I think you can either send them in online or write them down on a piece of paper and bring them up. And then those of you who are watching remotely through the chat function or through the platform, you can send in your questions. So we'll be able to ask the different speakers to address them. Moving on.
Could I just say, I don't really differ as such on the TRIPS waiver. All I'm saying is that the discussion has put these issues on the agenda. I mean, certainly, I'd like to see the TRIPS waiver, but, we all know that in the real world, these things, take time and, there's back and forth and so on. But, I'm not saying that, that I'm somewhat skeptical or whatever.
Okay, thanks. So maybe it's more of a question of glass half empty, glass half full, and you have you and Danny come at it from the different angles there. Anyway, hopefully we'll have a chance to get into the question again later if there's interest from the people listening in and watching. But still, without any further delay, I'm very pleased to have here Bernd Lange. I've read and heard much of your work, and so it's a real honor to be sitting next to you today. You're a parliamentarian, European parliamentarian, and from that perspective, what is your view on the WTO and its performance during the pandemic? Would you say that we need changes? And if so, should they be structural and therefore quite radical, or is it safer in a sense to make a few adjustments here and there so as not to destabilize the whole architecture?
Thanks a lot, Caroline, and thanks a lot for the invitation. And I'm totally convinced that we really need a robust reform of WTO. I guess the performance during the pandemic was not very well developed. Some tendencies we saw even before were also reflected during the crisis. So the tendency to go the national path to do unilateral measures, of course, specifically in the United States under Trump, but we found this also at the beginning of the pandemic. We had notified more than 150 trade restrictions and national measures, which really not led to solidarity in providing of vaccine and medical goods. And second, the WTO is losing trust. A lot of people fear that public goods might be coming under the market-oriented companies, just getting public services, for example, open to the free market and to public company, to private companies. And of course, you mentioned, Daniel, the 3% vaccination in Africa compared to 70% inside the European Union. And this is, of course, not a positive deliverable of the WTO. So therefore, I guess we have to reflect the principle, the old-fashioned economic theory of Ricardo and Smith, just cutting down tariffs and non-tariff barriers, and then growth will come to everybody because of the competitive advantages. It's not true. And we have to change this mind towards a clear rule-setting vision that we have a body, a multilateral body, which is setting rules for the market economy, which is in favor of the benefit of the people. And therefore, first, we have to integrate the SDGs into the WTO. It's really a crazy situation that we're discussing on the UN level sustainability, and we're discussing even binding treaties and whatever. But in the WTO, it is kind of revolution if we are discussing the subsidies on fish on a sustainable point of view. So integration of SDGs in WTO is, I guess, crucial. Secondly, I guess we should work together with other international organizations, so the World Bank, with the ILO and the WHO, so that we have an integrated approach to solve global problems. So the question of economic recovery and economic development in Africa, we heard just about that, is a common issue, and the institutions should really work together. And this is, of course, also, let's say, a question to the industrialized countries, even to the European Union, regarding the possibilities of set subsidies, and specifically in such a crisis that, of course, the result of the economic possibilities are quite different. And therefore, we have to find a global solution to have a better and fair distribution of investment, specifically in such a crisis. But this is, of course, a wish for the future and the robust WTO. Of course, I'm a realistic man, a politician, sometimes perhaps too realistic, but we have to really go ahead with this multilateral system. I have really the fear that we are losing support for the multilateral approach, because, as I mentioned at the beginning, the deliverables are quite narrow and not sufficient. And some countries are thinking about alternatives to WTO. And this, I guess, will not lead to a fair global situation. Perhaps this will lead to a block building situation between some Western countries and China. And this is not in the interest of the global community. And therefore, really, let's try to get really improvement in the fishery sector. It's important. Let's have a proper solution for health and trade with a waiver, no doubt about, but also with technology transfer and improving production capacities in developing countries, and also the recognition of regulatory obligations. That's also a crucial one, which is really harming the production capacity. Trade and health, I guess, is a second really important issue. And then let's start with the reform process. I'm totally convinced that will not come overnight. We have to create the path for the reform process in the rule setting, but also in the question of the working method. So the question of enhanced cooperation might be lead to some progress. So for the next year, let's build such a reform agenda to reach this wish of a better WTO in a reasonable time frame.
Thanks very much for your words of pragmatism there. I think it's important to remember that sometimes more haste is less speed, so to advance with prudence. But certainly, I know that there are a range of views on this, and perhaps in the question time we can address them. I wanted to say I was corrected. I made a mistake. I said you could send your questions in on the Zoom platform, which in fact you can't. If anybody has any questions or comments, please send them in on the platform, the online platform that you used to register for the session today. I actually have also been asked a question by the panel organizers in advance of this, so I've had some time to think about it. And in fact, the question that they asked me to address, it relates to the third R. We talked about robustness, resilience, and I've been asked to talk about the rights-based issue. And I see that it's already come up, and I think David mentioned it, rights-based trade, and James mentioned it in the right to trade, which are probably two very different things. And I'm going to speak of human rights and the human rights system. And the FES, the question they asked me was whether improving collaboration and understanding between trade professionals on the one hand and human rights professionals on the other might be a useful avenue to consider when thinking about reforming the WTO and trade policy. And actually my answer is clearly yes. And for a range of reasons, which of course I won't be able to develop all today, but let's just remind ourselves of the first, which I think we all know, is that people should be at the heart of considerations about trade policy. Sometimes I think was it maybe David or you mentioned about the negotiating process, we forget about the people and it sort of gets so much into the technicalities and the legalities and so on. And the other reason is that we believe that, well, I believe that human rights can offer guidance for economic policy making. And I think that that is all the more valuable today as the world realizes how vulnerable and how interlinked we all are. And what I'm embarking on exploration of is whether we can articulate this under the heading of human rights economics. So not so much human rights and economics, but really embedding some of the key human rights principles into economics. So it's not a concept that yet exists, but I'm asking myself the question of perhaps it should. And this process, which I'm working on in close collaboration and with the support of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, so I should really thank them for that here today, is to bring people, bring human rights advocates and economists together, first of all, to narrow the gap between these different universes that are trade policy and human rights practice. So in terms of content, one of the things that I'm looking at is whether human rights economics can bring to the fore the fact that people's preferences or their choices or lived experiences are not captured in the economic models that are used as a basis for developing trade policy or trade policy options in the negotiations. And so from a human rights perspective, more needs to be done to ensure that these non-monetary values are reflected and acknowledged in economic policy. And without necessarily putting a price on them, because we see that environmental economics treats externalities, so you put a price on them and bring them in. Some of that's antithetical to some of the deep beliefs that are relating that the human rights system is protects. And another aspect that I'll mention shortly is the question of accountability. And accountability is a central principle of human rights. And for a more human rights more human-centered trading system, I really think that this principle should be put front and center. And the research I've done so far shows that very few governments actually go back and revisit whether the claims they make about the benefits of a trade agreement have actually come true. So we know that new trade agreements, new trade measures benefit some people, but require adjustment on the part of others. And this is supposedly for over the long term, increased wealth for everyone. But we've been watching for a long time, and in some environments, those promised benefits don't actually accrue in the long term. And so who's accountable? Who's accountable if the trade policy has responded to the claims and the requests of those who are the most vocal in trade policy, and has left completely aside those who are maybe more remote from the decision making centers? This, I think, from a human rights perspective, is key to address, but also because better trade policy can be made if we know how previous such policies have played out. And under human rights, a principle, sort of practical implementation of the accountability principle is the duty to monitor. So this is something that is in all the human rights treaties, and I should say that all the WTO members, in fact, I think all countries in the world have ratified at least one of the legally binding international human rights treaties, and therefore are bound to monitor. And this can be a useful tool towards seeing how trade policy plays out on the ground, and how in the future we can both design better trade policies and also take the flanking and complementary measures necessary to protect those who have been adversely affected in this adjustment process. I see that we have a question. Oh dear, I saw a question came in, but unfortunately, oh good, we have a question that's just come in from the floor. It's picking up on Byrne's view, the pragmatic view on what should be done within the multilateral trading system. So the question is Is this a view that's widely shared within the EU? And are there differing points of view, and what might they be?
I think it's a, let's say, a fundamental position of the European Union, yes. Of course, we have some conflicts, no doubt about when it really gets to the concrete case. So I talked about subsidies, and of course, in the time of recovery, a lot of subsidies. Look to the transformation of car industry is there, and we, I guess, will look quite carefully for transform the jobs and reskill the people. Therefore, it might be not so easy to reduce the level of subsidies. Or the agriculture sector is also not, let's say, in line with fair understanding of agriculture production and, let's say, more extensive agriculture production. So there are conflicts in some areas inside the European Union as well. But as you mentioned, Caroline, looking to the people, bringing the people in the center, to the center of the trade policy, I guess this is now really the trade policy of the European Union. As you know, the European Commission presented a new trade strategy, the trade policy review in February, and this is totally clear. We want to get benefit for the people on the ground. And perhaps one further step looking to workers' rights in trade policy would be if we establish a working group on workers' rights here in the WTO. So I guess the last time workers' rights was just discussed in the end of 90s in WTO, but I guess now it's really the time, if we are really honest, bringing the people at the center of trade policy, let's start with workers' rights in WTO.
So I'm wondering whether anybody would like to respond to that particular point about the workers' rights in the WTO, or if Danny or David would like to pick up on any of the other points made and respond or comment on them. Okay.
I'm happy.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
David.
No, please go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I'm always happy to see workers' rights being put in the center of all policy forums. Forgive me if I'm a little skeptical about whether or not in the current environment, the World Trade Organization is likely to be a fruitful forum. We have a blockage in the International Labour Organization because the International Employers Body is not even acknowledging that workers have the right to withdraw their labour, something that I thought we had dealt with in the 1800s when we abolished slavery. In that environment, forgive me for being a little skeptical about whether the World Trade Organization is I think the point that Caroline made is a fascinating one about holding governments to account essentially for the claims they make about trade agreements. I've worked for ministers who like to stand in front of buildings and open them, or farms, and claim that there's all these benefits, and certainly the farmers or various people will vouch for that. But some of the general equilibrium modelling upon which these claims are made are nothing short of heroic, in terms of the assumptions they make. And you look at some of the work where they simply no longer issue full employment and market clearance, which frankly is the norm in pretty much every economy in the world, and suddenly the benefits disappear. So I do think that there is a real role for a little bit more accountability in some of these claims. I too am absolutely worried about the multilateral system, and I really do think it's a real problem. I'm a strong supporter of the labour movement. It's a strong supporter. It's apart from the fact that people are dying from COVID, it's the other reason why the TRIPS waiver is so critical. If it takes another 18 months to do anything, it's 3 years before they deal with this question. I think the majority of people in the world, particularly the developing world, but also the developed world, the population will just lose faith in the ability of the multilateral system if it can't trigger its own waiver clause
to deal with people who are dying. And so I really do think that, prudence is important, but nobody asked our members to be prudent when COVID hit. Nobody said, oh, if you're a nurse, you don't really have to go in until we work this one out. Prudence is fine. Nobody said to the ambulance drivers, it's okay, just wait a few months and we'll work this out. Our members leapt into action to protect us. I don't see why we can't leap into action to protect them now. And if we don't, people will begin to think that the multilateral system is not fit for purpose.
So a real wake-up call there to action. David, I think you wanted to add something.
Sure.
I'm
Yes,
proposed
yes,
to
I
give the
could.
closing words to you because we'll actually be cut off.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, brutally.
No,
So
I
I'll
do
let
recognize that. I recognize there are several conversations taking place, more or less at the same time in this session. But coming back to the question of Africa and how better trade policy can advance and support structural change in Africa, I think what this pandemic has shown is that dependence on commodities has not worked for Africa, and it's not going to work going into the future. So I think, and the message I wanted to bring out was that the fundamental challenge now really is to look at inwards into intra-African trade, to look at what's good that's happening in intra-African trade and how you can support that. But very clearly, what we have seen from this pandemic is that the commodity prices were the first to tumble, and with all the knock-on effects that we have seen. I think much of what has been said is, of course, important, but in terms of inserting Africa into this discussion, I think we need to stand back and look, as you say, at how better trade policy can result in better human rights, human development, and so on.
Thanks. So we seem to be concluding on the rights are, but let's not forget the importance of resilience and robustness. And I think Danny has pointed us to the importance of for the organization to be responsive, most of all, to people's needs, which will help it to survive the current crisis we're in. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for your patience with our technical challenges. And thank you. I mean, I think I really congratulate you, David, Bernd, and Danny, because you covered a lot of really important ground in the short time we had. So I certainly found it very interesting, and I'm lucky enough to be here and to be able to continue the conversation with you offline for another few minutes. Thanks, everyone. Bye, David.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Okay, bye. Bye. It's been a pleasure. Bye.